Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of my Advanced Squad Leader tutorial set. What I'm going to do today is talk about the beginning of the game and how to set it up. You'll see in front of me a number of pieces, places, dice, and all sorts of things that are out there, and I'm going to walk through basically how to set up any game. The reason I'm doing this is because sometimes this can be quite daunting, especially for the new player. So let's go through all of the items. First of all, you're going to need the rule book. What I have here in front of me is the pocket edition of the rule book. It has all the relevant chapters, latest of the errata, and also next to it I have the charts. This is a third-party product from Le Frontier, and this is the rat charts. It has all the charts that you'll need to play. Next up, you're going to need a scenario. And for this one, I've chosen the Tractor Works. And this is from ASL Classic. It's available as a free download from multimanpublishing.com. And I've chosen this one because of the complex setup involved. Now let's see what else we need. What is represented here are some of the chits that are needed to play. In this case, I have the counters for the German. I have the information counters in a box below. Some people keep them stored in envelopes. Some people keep them stored in a baggie. And I'm sure some people keep them stored in a bathtub. I choose to keep them in this plastic container. For the rest of the items that are needed, we have to go to the scenario card. And let's start at the top. Right here it talks about the board configuration. It talks about using board number 1. What I have laid out in front of me is that same board. Next, it'll talk about what the Soviets need, a number of charts or a number of counters and so forth, and I have taken the time and laid them out here. Same thing with the Germans, and I've laid them out over here. Now let's go to the actual setup. I'm going to start here with the Soviets. Here are all the leaders involved in the Soviet order of battle. And what I have below the 9 minus 0 is a commissar. This is unique to the Soviets. What they can do at the beginning of the game is they can take an 8 minus 0 or an 8 minus 1 leader and convert him into a commissar. The commissar rules will be explained elsewhere. For the purposes of this scenario, I am going to exchange one of the 8 minus zeros for a commissar. Prior to setting up, the Germans also have some decisions to make as well. What they can do is, along with most other armies, and the Russians obviously cannot, is they can choose to deploy 10% of their squads with fractions rounding up. In this scenario, they have 19 squads, and for the purposes of this scenario, they are going to deploy 2 squads. One of the 8-3-8 squads here will deploy into 2 half squads of 3-3-8s. And from this group, one of the 4-6-7s will deploy into the 2-4-7 half squads depicted here. Finally, here are 3 counters that are not depicted anywhere else. You will need sniper counters, 1 for each side, unless the snipers are NA. And also what I have here is a turn counter. This is a third-party product that has Soviets on one side and Germans on the other. This helps you keep track of who's playing what and when. Now let's get to the actual setup. This is where you need to consult the chart to see who sets up where and when. In this case, up in the turn record chart, you can see here it says sequential setup. It has a couple of numbers there. Those are the base point values of the 2 forces. And then finally, it'll say who's going to roll first. But let's just worry about one thing at a time. In this case, setting up first are elements of the 308th Rifle Division. Their ELR is 3. They set up first in building X-Ray 3. Let's have a look at this. Here is Hex X-Ray 3 right here. When it says building X3, you can set up anywhere. So anywhere in that hex. And remembering back to our original reading of chapter B, we know that this building with more than 3 hexes and with the stairwell hexes is a 3-level building, level 0, level 1, and level 2. However, let's go to the special rules. Building X3 is a factory, and then in there, in the rules reference, you can see exactly what's happening. The other thing that's happening, you can see here, is that non-prisoner Russians in that building are fanatic. Let's go back to the building and have a look. Essentially, this building is the same height as the other 3-level buildings around it. However, as a factory, all the inside hexes are open, and they can be seen all the way throughout. Each hex, when fired at from within that building, has a TEM of 1. Also, intervening hex sides have a line of sight hindrance of +1. So, a unit here, firing at a unit here, would get +1 for hindrance and +1 for TEM for net +2. Firing from outside is still a +3. Now let's get into the mechanics of the setup. You will note when looking at the setup information for this force that there are a number of infantry support weapon counters as well as a number of concealment counters, a total of 18. I've done the first step here, and I do this out of view of my opponent, and this is just representative. What I've placed is a number of counters and men around with various heights of stacks with a leader here in the middle. Again, this is just representative, and I just basically threw them down almost randomly. Now let's talk about the concealment. What I've done now is I've placed all the available concealment counters down off to the side. Essentially, without getting into a lot of detail, if you are given concealment counters as part of your setup, then any of the applicable units in that setup element, if they are set up in concealment terrain, can have these added onto them as if they were units unto themselves. For example, on this hex here, I could place 2, 3, or even 4 concealment counters in order to make it look like it has more. Also, should I choose, I could leave it blank and have it filled with nobody. I am now going to lay all the concealment counters down. And what we see here is the end result. Concealment counters have been placed on each hex, and what I've chosen to do is to make all the outside hexes look like they have a total of 4 counters, as you can see here as it zooms in. There you go. And of course, those 2 in the middle are a little bit higher. They're obviously where maybe the reserve forces are and so forth. So that's the first part of the setup. Now let's talk about the rest. The next part of the setup it says here for the Germans, set up second after the Russians, as indicated. You'll notice we have 3 groups. Company A sets up in those buildings. Kampfgruppe Staller sets up in those buildings. And note they have concealment counters. And Tinem sets up in those. The best way to do this is to do each one individually. And again, whether they are concealed or not, they are set up out of line of sight of your opponent. Let's set them up. Now we're getting into the setup for Staller's Kampfgruppe. What I've done, again, without much thought to the tactics behind it, is I've placed out the infantry and machine gun units all throughout these buildings. And I have labeled right here, I just have off to the side the concealment counters. Remembering that this building can be set up as a part of their setup area, along with these 3 stone buildings here. I will now lay out the concealment counters. There, now the concealment counters are laid out. Now let's look over here to building R7, which we see right up here. As a reminder, there's no real unit enemy, or no real unit in there. The same here over at S5. Those are dummy stacks, and we'll talk about them when the game gets underway. Let's now to set up the rest of the force. And here we have it. The setup is complete of all the onboard forces. What you'll see here are a number of unconcealed Germans. The Russians have yet to complete their setup, but the point here is this. Each of these stacks is unconcealed. However, Due to the right of inspection rules, you are not allowed to look into it. And as you can see, what I've done as a German is I have concealed my leaders underneath those stacks somewhere. Now to set up the final Soviets. And there we have it. Now the Russians are all set up. Notice again that they are only visible to see what's on their top. We know that there's machine guns down here at R1, but we don't know where the leaders are or any of the, or where the commissar is. Now for the next part is concealment gain. Essentially what happens in concealment gain is any unit that is not in line of sight of an enemy unit, whether it's real, concealed, or whatever, can gain concealment. Therefore, all these concealed counters in the middle, those stacks, whether real or otherwise, will prevent those that are not concealed and in line of sight from being seen. I will now conceal them. And concealed. Over on the German side, nobody has line of sight to him, and nobody has line of sight to him. The rest of the units, they are denied. For example, these fellows over here are denied by the Soviets in here. Same with all these guys along here. On the Soviet relief force, only 2 hexes, here and here, are able to conceal, and the rest are in full view. The final thing to do is to place your sniper on. I will do it now. The snipers have been placed. The provision is that they have to be within 6 hexes of 6 enemy units if at all possible. We see the German is right here within many. The Soviet here again is with this force. You can see he's going to try to put his effort here. The German is trying to put his somewhere in the middle. Now, the final part. This scenario is unique in that you have to roll to see who goes first. For the sake of argument, the colored die will represent the Soviets, the white die will represent the Germans. I will roll these dice, and the higher of the 2 will go first. And the Soviets are going to roll first. This is the part where you shake hands and wish your opponent the best of luck. Okay, and that's it for the setup, and then you can get on to the game itself. I hope I've been able to explain the setup and some of the nuances that go along with it, including the very weird one, if you want to call it that, where you place the sniper counter such that the numeral 1 is up in line with the board numbers that it is on. Again, it's not a rule, it's just a convention. All right, if you have any questions or any clarifications you want asked, please leave them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed.